looking at Conor and some of his speeches and his imagery, the first thing that shows up for me is his confidence. And confidence comes from puberty and from about 6 years old. And confidence can be built up by overpowering shame. And when I look at Conor's past, his father was away a lot. His father was in the military and he wasn't really home. And he was also a baby brother to two older sisters. So Conor's been surrounded by feminine women for most of his life, for all of his early childhood. Not for most of his life, for his early childhood. So in that, his masculinity may have been suppressed or repressed based upon how his sisters and his mother saw men. Conor McGregor. I'm going to do a characterology analysis on Conor McGregor. And for those of you who have seen me do analysis before, either in my podcast or on some of my YouTube videos, what I walk you through is what an individual's character has become, which I can see on their body from their childhood injuries, how they grew up, what their family dynamic was, where they've come from, potential multi-generational issues or injuries. So what I'm going to go into in Conor McGregor's stages of development, and from birth all the way to maybe teenager, puberty. And in each one of those stages, there's injuries that can be occurred by how unsafe the world makes you feel, or how rejected you are, or how you've gone to express your most authentic self and then been ridiculed or humiliated for it, right? So with Conor McGregor, he's an interesting cat. And part of my research to get to the bottom of whatever's going on here, part of my research to unpack what's really behind Conor McGregor's personality, his character, his lifestyle, requires me to dive deep into imagery, looking at his body, looking at his movements, looking at how he speaks, and then doing some background research to confirm my findings, because I'm not working with him. So if I was working with him, I could ask questions based on what I could see in his body, and he could either confirm or deny those. But like I said, I'm not working with him. And in that, this is all conjecture, right? Because I'm not confirming with him. I'm using third-rate evidence to confirm my findings. So without further ado, and me rattling on, let's find out about Conor McGregor. And I might throw in a bit of Irish accent, a bit of Dublin, and I jump between Scottish and Dublin, Scots and the Irish, because I get their accents mixed up, but that's not what I do. I do characterology, and I'm a relationship consultant, and I use this technology to guide me into your instinct injuries, to give you freedom, trust yourself, and help you live a life full of fun, playfulness, exhilaration, from how you communicate to your sex life. So in that, let's start. Now, looking at Conor and some of his speeches and his imagery, the first thing that shows up for me is his confidence. And confidence comes from puberty and from about 6 years old. And confidence can be built up by overpowering shame. And when I look at Conor's past, his father was away a lot. His father was in the military and he wasn't really home. And he was also a baby brother to two older sisters. So Conor's been surrounded by feminine women for most of his life, for all of his early childhood. Not for most of his life, for his early childhood. So in that, his masculinity may have been suppressed or repressed based upon how his sisters and his mother saw men. Right. Now, because his father was away a lot, his mother actually cheated on his father. And what this creates in a family dynamic is a mistrust of women. And that can play out as resentment towards women. And I don't know much about Conor's intimate relationship with Dee, but what can play out, especially in the bedroom and sexual nature, is this resentment can come up in overtly aggressive sexual behavior, where the resentment towards women is played out in the partner, where there might be derogatory statements, any way to place the partner lower on a pedestal of partnership. And like I said, this may or may not be true. And what I'm painting here is a picture of what I see, not what is. And I really want you to take this into consideration when I'm speaking to this. So what I speak to in that character of this, the resentment towards women, creates something in characterology called the phallic narcissistic male. And when I talk about phallic narcissistic male, I'm using terms derived from Wilhelm Reich's characterology and character analysis. So the narcissist component is old German, right? And when I use narcissist, I'm not using it in the context of modern day DSM-5 characteristics. I'm using it as like a pathology to give someone a container to put elements of behavior into, right? So if you can remove the morality from the words or the charge from the words narcissist, you'll enjoy my conversation much more, right? So with the phallic narcissistic character, what can play out here is a need for competition. And I see this in all of Conor's work. Like, he's obsessed with fighting. He's obsessed with being the best. And what can reside underneath all of that is a deep sense of shame, that less than, humiliation. And with the phallic narcissistic male, the sub-injury is known as a rigid. And a rigid has a shadow component, and a gift component, like a shadow and a golden shadow, depending if you want to use Jung. And the achiever has a number of defenses, and I'm going to speak to them. And I'm going to be doing much more of these. So if this one excites you, then like it, share it, comment on it. Yeah, John, this is great. I'd love to hear more of this. So with the rigid, or the achiever, the challenge here is for them to connect their heart to their genitals. And this can be environmental. This might mostly show up with his relationship with his partner. And the physical build here, and you could argue this based on his fighting style and what he's needed to do to build his body up, is there's a rigid back and jaw, and the pelvis kind of tilts back a bit. So this phallic narcissistics, his cock is forward, right? He pushes his penis forward because he leads with his sexuality, right? But he holds his heart back. You see him when he walks, and it'll switch depending on who he's around, right? He can lead with his chest up, like I'm proud, or he can lead with his cock forward. It really depends on who he's with, right? These are subtle trends in behavior that if you didn't know what you were looking at, you wouldn't see them, right? And in this, these are all defenses, right? So if he was working with me, I would casually look at him, what defense he was currently in, right? And be mindful of that while I would be exploring what it is that he really wants out of life. And his posture is perfect. Like, if you look at him, like, he stands there with a presence, even when he's in a chair. Where this shifts is when he's drinking, when he's on some kind of depressant or something. His posture changes. He moves into a masochistic frame where alcohol becomes a vice to avoid feeling whatever he's really feeling, right? And this could be something that's multi-generational or sad, or maybe he just enjoys a drink. It really boils down to how honest can he be with himself as to why he needs alcohol. As with anyone that needs alcohol, maybe it's anxiety. I mean, he's mentioned before that he does have fear and anxiety. And for a rigid, the achiever, what can show up here, and I see this in his eyes, is a sadness. It's a pervading sadness that he cannot really be who he is, that whoever he shows up as is rejected. And we don't know much about his early sexual escapades in his childhood, in his teenage years when he hits puberty. But that tends to be where this injury comes in, where if he was a bit of a mummy's boy or maybe a sister's boy, which might have played out in his relationships with his family dynamics because he did have two older sisters, is like his mum and his sisters could have been attracted to him at some level, or gave excessive sexual attention to him, and maybe framed his reality of women in a way that has impacted his future relationships. But in that, there's a sadness of not being able to show up sexually how he wants to. And this can be overcompensatory, where he might use his sexual aggression as a way to exert status over a woman. I think there was a social media post he did ages ago where, he could have been getting a blowjob from his missus. I think the statement, what he said was, if you're getting it, get it top floor of the triple deck. If you're getting it, get it on the top floor of the triple deck. He was on his yacht. And that's a status piece. He ended up deleting it. And I'm assuming because in that moment, I don't know if he was drinking or where he was at. So him in a sexual place will activate this injury, right? So if his wife was there, even if he was fantasizing about being physically intimate, it'll activate this injury where he's like, oh, I've got to seem more than, how can I not be humiliated? How can I overpower this underlying sexual shame? I'll post something on social media to exert my dominance. Because in that moment, I might have been feeling really vulnerable with my partner, but instead of being vulnerable, he flipped it into dominance, right? So in that, he can also be quite hyperactive, like have high energy. So what happens there in energetic rhythm with an achiever and a rigid is that they can focus on whatever they want to do and become hyperactive towards it, right? A rigid will hold all of their vitality on the outside of their body. And what do I mean by that is when they're still, that's when their sadness comes up. When they're with themselves, this is when the reality of like, fuck, I'm actually not all that great. And the inner critic takes over, which is why you might see him going into depressive states or resorting to alcohol, because when that depressive state comes in, you want to use something to up that, to stay in a high state. The back. So I don't know if he has any back injuries or really tight around his back. And sure, you could argue that because of what he does, he will just have musculature injuries. But his back, especially the base of the neck to the sacral, and the forehead, he will have. That's where a lot of his energy is being kept. Especially for the rigid, they can fear being rejected and fear being rejected and receiving love. So you find quite a lot of tightness between the two shoulder blades. He's also very contained energetically, so he doesn't let loose very often. You'll see him when he's in his suit, contained. So rigids know how to be in a place in order to appear all together, and only his closest friends might ever see him really let down his boundaries. And this can be also a strategic thing for marketing and branding, and it might also be a part of him that he denies, where if he could just be himself all the time instead of needing to put on a facade, he might not feel the pervading sadness that I see in his eyes whenever I look at him speaking. If I was working with him, rigids tend to invoke competition, right? And which makes them challenging to work with as a characterology specialist, where I would start exploring some of his injuries, and there might be a part of him that doesn't want to seem less than me, so he'll attempt to compete. For example, he might say, "Oh, but John, you don't have two belts. John, you've never been in the ring with anyone." So yeah, I haven't, but that doesn't change the fact that in your reality right now, there's a pervading sadness that you keep avoiding. Right. So in order for me to know that there's a competition that will appear, especially when we start hitting on some of these injury wounds, especially sexually or emotionally, like talking about his relationship with his partner, like what would you, if I audited his relationship with his partner, how would she feel out of 10? How would she feel about the relationship with him? And she might, typically rigids team up with rigids or orals. Usually it's a rigid and a rigid. How would she feel about the emotional connection with him? Right? Does he listen to her? Maybe he does. I don't know this. These are the assumptions that I'm making based on what I've seen and the evidence that I have. When he's in this injury, when he's dropped deep into this, and he's in the defense, either choice can be wrong. So what can happen is instead of being with that shame of not knowing, you overpower it. So yeah, fuck it. I'll do this. Yeah, fuck it. And it can be this, this really overpowering. I'm not going to be with the indecision. I'm not going to be seen to be indecisive and confused. I'm just going to make a decision. Yeah, fuck it. Right. And that can show up in his leadership. You see that when he's in the ring. So the weaknesses here in the rigid is they can be quite inflexible, and they fear failure and fear rejection. So the fear of failure would drive someone like Conor McGregor into succeeding around fighting. What happens for the rigid is when they hit the pinnacle of their achievement, they can't always fully celebrate it. It's like they're already looking for the next thing, right? And that can bring up a depressive state. They're just never happy. They can't be with all the celebration. So they can look outside of themselves for celebration, which can be buying things or spending money on family, like making sure that their family's happy, like seeing their family happy can brighten them up, like make them feel good instead of like sorting themselves out, what's actually going to make them happy. And we see that, like he gives a lot of money to his siblings and his dad and his mum. So the recurring pattern with the rigid is being rejected, and that can be rejected from fans, from family, and fathers. So what I see in a lot of Conor's work is being rejected by his father at some level that he's always looking for, well, not always looking for, but he's looking for his father's acknowledgement, right? The photos that I see him with his dad, there's this, look at me, Dad. I see like a youngster, like a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, look at me, Dad. Mostly because his dad was not home. So he was looking to his mum, but there's a different energy that comes from a father. There's a groundedness that can come from a dad that a mother can't provide, especially if it's a mother of multiple children. I'm going to jump over to another injury that he has, and this is the oral. And what I see in his eyes, a combination of the sadness, is an ocular block. And someone with an ocular block has a risk of addictions. And he might not show these addictions, but he might struggle with them. He might do his best to avoid alcohol, but he can really feel there's this pull, this hunger that he's not satisfied. He needs something else. And this addiction can be leveraged into, for example, fighting. But underneath all of that can be this inadequacy where there's a hunger for, I just don't feel full. So there can be a collapsing under the pressure of not feeling full. So there can be this to and fro energetically and in the lifestyle of, oh, I'm so shit. Oh, I've got to go and do this now. Oh, I'm collapsed. I need to exhaust. Oh, I've got to go and fight again or whatever. So there can be this yo-yo of effective, oh, I'm stuck. Oh, I've got to do this. And it can be exhausting for a person and can be quite unpredictable in a relationship dynamic, right? The other piece I'll speak to here is a schizoid. So we've gone through the rigid, the oral, and the schizoid. Now, a schizoid injury happens very early in life. It can happen in before or at birth. And it can also come later in life when your life feels threatened, if you feel like you could die, right? But it is installed at the early points in childhood, usually between like 0, 1, sometimes 2. And the schizoid injury hurts their feet a lot, right? And from his fighting, his feet seem to be the weakest points, right? So in order for a schizoid to soothe this injury, to integrate this injury, requires him to be safe on Earth, feel safe on planet Earth. And it starts in early childhood. Maybe he was bullied by his sisters or his mum or somebody else, or maybe his dad at a very early age. And that pattern of relating to people plays out in school, where he was bullied in school. And so this reoccurring theme of, I'm not safe. I mean, at some point, there's an example of him putting a dumbbell or a barbell in his bag. So if he needed to fight, he'd have a weapon there to fight with. This is when he was a kid. But there's this playing up to his strong cardio and being able to run away from kids. But in that, there's a humiliation of not being able to stand and fight. So off the back of that injury, learning how to box and standing and fighting, right? So you could assert or query how much of his will to fight has come from this injury in childhood of being bullied. Just let that land. Right? So in this concept of free will and being able to create your own destiny, how much of it is he living from an injury of not feeling safe and wanting to fight? Now, he'd also have a habit of beating up sparring partners rather than wanting to learn from them and seeing what they do. And then he'd also like celebrate by going out drinking. And by celebrate, what is he celebrating for? Like beating someone up or not? This is what I've read. I don't know if this is what he actually did, but in the context of beating up sparring partners, seeing himself as greater than and better than, and not being able to be humbled in order to learn from them. Then this is a rigid injury and a psychopathic injury. And again, when I speak to psychopath, I'm not speaking to the DSM-5. I'm speaking to the character analysis, characterology by Wilhelm Reich, Alexander Lowen, and John Parakos. And if you're liking this so far, comment, share it, bookmark it. Let me know in the comments that you're really enjoying this and I'll do more. When doubling back to when his mother cheated on his father, there could be resentment towards the mother and maybe even some disgust towards his father. Like, what kind of man lets his wife cheat on him? Where were you? What were you doing? What was really important that you needed to be in the military? And for a lot of fathers to really own the responsibility of being home and dealing with your child's cries can be a real challenge. And this is a different epoch. And I don't want to make excuses here because there's an injury here. And while Conor's a little bit older now and he can make sense and forgive his father, what I assert is there's still a little child running his life, running his body, running his habits, running his addictions, running behavior that he needs to like show up as someone who's bigger than who he is, which can cascade into behavior of denying the self, like what's really there, being able to feel the injuries of childhood and be an open-hearted man that's connected to his cock and his heart. And it doesn't mean he'd lose his fighting edge. What it does mean is that he's connected to something that's much bigger than he is, right? And this would also resolve and bring his sadness inside himself. He'd become aware of his sadness, right? So in all of this characterology, if he was working with me, what I'd ask him is, what's his personal relationship like? And what does he see himself doing after he finishes boxing? And what did he want to do before he started boxing? Because there might be a 5-year-old child in there that wants to do something else. And right now, for a rigid, what can happen when they hit that pinnacle of wherever they want to go, they can go into self-sabotage because there's nothing else left. They've done all the achievements. So they can just go into a self-destructive cycle of, well, I've done everything. What's the point? And he also does charity work as well, which may or may not be authentic for him. He might still be needing to overcompensate for who he is at the core. This feeling of unworthiness that he needs to overcompensate for. And again, this is a rigid injury. And the psychopathic injury, which serves him incredibly well in his boxing, can also show up as homosexual fantasy as well, where in order to dominate his partner, he would rather fight them than fuck them. So there's a part that can play out here where he might feel a deep love for his opponent, like a deep love, but he needs to keep that at an arm's reach because he wouldn't want to display homosexual trends because that could be too feminine for him, too effeminate. But he might joke about it, right? Like, fuck some guy in the ass, which is a classic phallic narcissistic trait as well. But in all of that, he doesn't know how to be himself. Like, he feels like it could be a betrayal that's approaching for him if he was to open his heart to a man. What a psychopath in this context is really good at is seduction. They're exceptional at seduction. For women, he'll use charming language. And I don't know what his his long-term relationship's been like seduction-wise. But you'll see him on social media, like he'll be able to seduce anyone because he's got it in him. He's got that really good balance, being able to balance between that masculine and feminine to serve a purpose. And this is what achievers are really good at. And psychopaths. The golden shadow of the psychopath is a leader or an inspirer. So an integrated psychopath can lead someone with their heart. And the personal issue with the psychopath is being able to trust people. I'm okay with trusting others. And the defense can be an undercharge in the legs, the injury, the weakness here. So you can move quick, but what happens here with a psychopath is they can come out really strong, but their energy depletes really quickly. So when he learns his opponents, he knows the strategy of what he needs to do. But if he was with a fighter that can adapt really quickly and knows how to string him out over long fights, he will burn out. And just quickly, what I'm going to do is double over to human design, which is a system that's based on chakras and astrology. And Conor McGregor is a manifestor. And a manifestor is known to have a repelling aura. And they're really good at what I call burst damage, where they can get into a situation and they can put all of their energy in, but then they need to rest. It's also known as a glass cannon. Because if you could picture a glass cannon, they come out firing, but the longer you keep firing, it's going to crack. And there are other types within human design, but in this instance, I'm just going to be talking about Conor McGregor. So in this, being the manifestor, he can come out strong and he can come out with a lot of energy. But if you can hold him off, dodge, work his legs, then the fight won't go in his favor. And that's what I'm asserting here. I'm not a fight specialist. I'm just observing what I see through characterology. Now, if what I've said has spoken to you and you'd love to learn more, then put it in the comments and even recommend someone that you'd love to see a character analysis on. I've done Trump before. I've done Elon Musk. I'll do another Elon Musk. But this is really powerful technology, and it can be used in a compassionate way, as well as a informative and educational and entertaining way to speak to the human body and how trauma can show up in the body in predictable behavior. And the compassion piece is I can look at someone and go, look, I can tell your childhood injuries, what they are, what your most dominant defense is, and work with it to get deeper into your subconscious to extract whatever instinct injury is preventing you from living your most fullest life, from maybe stopping you from trusting yourself, from stopping you from living a life that's not full of sabotage or depression or anxiety or feeling like you don't belong, right? And this is why I do what I do, because this stuff goes beyond what traditional talk therapy does. It uses the body. So if I was to work with Conor, with body work wise, if I was to fly out and see him, which is what I do in some of my premium stuff, is I'd work his back in particular, I'd work his pelvis and work his legs, particularly his calves and his feet. And in that, I take him through breath work as well, Reichian breath work. And Reichian breath work is where East meets West breath work. This is where we introduce the technology of structure versus the wisdom of the breath. And it's powerful, powerful breath work. And it helps you access injuries and integrate at the same time. So if this has fascinated you, like I mentioned before, like, share it, comment. And if it hasn't fascinated you, then I'm sure I have plenty of other content on my other channels that might entertain you. Thank you, much love, and goodbye.